lecture was so important. We're going to go over the example of the tutorial again. Again, I'm not posting these examples because it's your job to complete the tutorial on your own. But I do want to make sure that you have a chance to see it a couple of times because I know you don't always catch something the very first time you see it. So we're going to follow along the tutorial. We're going to, like last time, we're just going to do part of it. And then we're going to examine the code that we get. All right. So I go into Visual Studio and I say I want a new project. I want it to be an ASP.NET Core web app. Select Next. I give the project a name. Make sure I have the right name that they want. They want Razor Pages movie. Now you might notice that my screen looks a little different. Newer version of Visual Studio, but the essentials of it are the same. I can put it somewhere. I can put it in a source repository. I am instead going to put it on the desktop. I'm choosing the framework of .NET 6.0. Authentication type, none. That means that you do not log on. You don't need to log on to do anything in this application. There's no log on. So click Create. It does its thing and generates a bunch of files. And those files we can view by going under View and choose Solution Explorer. All right, that will create in whatever destination we chose a folder, and in it contains all those folders and files and so on that we created. Remember, when you turn in your assignment, you will turn in this entire folder. So you'll right mouse on it, zip it up, and turn in the whole folder. All right, so we've created that. First thing we're going to do in this, after we've created the application, is we are going to create a model. Now, we talked about last time how the model maps to the database. We are using in this course the model first approach, which means we define the model and generate the database from the model. The other way would be as if you had already a completed database and wanted to generate the model from the completed database. That might be more suitable if you already had an application going, let's say, and you had a SQL Server database or some other kind of database, and you wanted to generate the model from that. If you're starting from scratch, I would think the model first approach is the one that I would pursue. So I'm going to add a new folder in my project for models. Or models. Inside of it, I'm going to add new item, and it's going to be simply a C# class file. And this is going to be the name of the entity. And generally speaking, I like to put the singular version of the name as the name of the model. So I'm calling this movie as opposed to movies. Because this class represents a single movie. Calling it movie, add, and I have an empty shell of a class. Here you would type in your code. I'm simply going to just copy and paste. All right. And going to save it. All right. So we've created our model, our model for movie. Next we're going to do is we're going to scaffold some pages. Right? These are the basic database maintenance functions: create, retrieve, update, and delete. So I'm going to go create in the pages folder. I'm going to create a folder, and this I'm going to make the plural. I've run into trouble when I've had the model match the same thing as the pages folder. It gets confused about what you mean when you say movies or movie or whatever. That's why I keep the model name singular, and under the pages I use the plural name. All right, so I right mouse here, say add new scaffolded item. You have a bunch of choices of a bunch of things to do. We're going to create Razor pages using Entity Framework with the default create, retrieve, update, and delete functionality. It'll ask us for the model class. We'll pick movie. It's the only one we have. For the data context class, well, we don't have a data context yet. We're going to add the default name here. We should remember this because we're going to use the same thing if we were to do a second table or a third table like you need to do for upcoming assignment. I'm going to use a layout page. We talked about layout pages before. Those sort of provide some common code. If I don't specify anything, it will use the default layout page, which we only have one layout page, so we're in business. I click add. It does its thing. It may require installing some packages. A lot of this kind of thing, Visual Studio handles sort of on its own. Please don't ever get impatient with that. Think how long it would take you to write this code from scratch. So if it takes a minute to generate something, you're not going to be able to code all these pages in a minute by hand. So it's going to be well worth the wait. And as I mentioned, we see a create, delete, edit, which includes the update, and details and index, which includes the retrieve functionality. The last thing we have to do is we have to make sure that the database is synced up with the model. So we do this by running our command line tool, Management Console. And the first thing we do is we create a migration. A migration is a set of changes that we're going to apply to a database. So if we create our initial model, we create a migration from that, we update the database. If we go and make additional database changes, we can go in and create a new migration, which will include just those changes. So if we ever have to roll back to a previous version of the database, it's possible. Excuse me. So I'm going to add migration. And I'm going to call it something like initial migration. Console does its thing for a minute, and it creates the migration. It gives us a warning, but that's okay. We're not terribly worried about the warning. Finally, we're actually going to update the database. That's going to take the pending migration that we just created and apply the changes to the database. It does its thing, generates some tables. We can actually look to see what it does. And we can go under View, SQL Server Object Explorer, and actually see the database that it creates. Razor Pages Movies, the name of our context, and we see inside there it created a movies table. It has all the properties we have. Now, it's valuable to look at the database, but remember, any changes that we're going to make through the model, because we have to make sure the model and the database sync up. All right, so even though we can go into the database and change things, you're asking for trouble, because then the model and database are liable to get out of sync and you're liable to have problems. Okay, let's make sure this works. And then we're going to take a closer look at many of these pages. Generating code is awesome. However, remember, it's still your project. The fact that Visual Studio did some work for you is a bonus for you. You got to own that code. You have to understand how it works, because you're liable to, very likely, liable to have to make modifications on your own. And therefore, you need to understand how it works. And some of this is a little confusing. It'll take time. And we'll go over this periodically to review stuff. But I want to start out by giving just an overview of the different functionality on the different pages. The last thing I have to do is I have to go into the layout file and add the selection for movies. Add the menu item for movies. Please make sure that you do this. If you don't do this, I don't know how to access your pages. And that's not very user-friendly, where the user would have to know the name of something to type in. So we want to call the index sort of the home page for movies. So it's in the movies section. Movies is the name that I gave the pages folder. And I want to call the index. The index maps to that index CSHTML. And I'll call this movies. All right, there's more to the tutorial, but I want you guys to have some fun on your own. So you'll do things like create a search functionality and other things. So now we go and run this. We get a couple of warnings. We can click Don't Ask Me Again. And it brings up our application. We click on Movies. I get an empty screen. The index shows a list of all the movies that have been added so far. I haven't added any movies, so I'm going to click New and add a movie. Iron Man, which I don't know when that was released. We'll make up a number. I don't like the fact that we type in the genre here, but they wanted to keep the first example simple. You should be able to define a list of genres and be able to choose those lists from a drop down. And we'll say the price of it is $19. We go back, our listing now shows that. We can create another one. I don't like that because if I typed in superhero and I spelled superhero wrong, it's going to now think there's two different genres, one called superhero and one called superhero. All right, so it would be better if we had a separate entity for this, but again, this is the first example. So there we have the list. And as we add items to this list, it'll expand. All right, I want to preview the functionality. We've already seen the create and we've seen the index. Details simply show all the details associated with that item. Edit will allow us to change. And delete will prompt us, and if we say yes, it will actually delete. So pretty basic functionality. The basic functionality of create, retrieve, update, and delete. Now notice that there's no related tables in effect here. All right, so everything's simple, everything's in one. Okay. Let's look at the homepage for movies, that index.cshtml. And we want to look at close some of these other windows down so they don't clutter things. Actually, if I do this, close all but this. All right. Let's look at the model first. All right, because as you might expect, the razor page for the index is going to be some static HTML along with data that we're pulling from the model, sort of blanks that we're filling in from the model. So I think it's important to look at the model first. We have a list called an iList of movies called movie. If you're not familiar with the syntax before, if you've not seen the syntax before, an iList represents a collection like an array, but more powerful than an array. What is it an array of? Because it's in those triangle brackets, it's an array of movie objects. What do I mean by movie objects? I mean the objects that we created, or the class that we created here. This is where the movies come from. This movie object. Each movie is represented by a movie object. And the index, or the home page, has a list of them. That's what this line of code says. All right. What this is simply saying is, if from the context, what is the context? Well, we use the context when we originally scaffold the movie class. The context is a database that contains this. So we're looking in the database for movies. We're seeing if the list of movies in the database is null or not. And if it's null, then we don't do anything and we display an empty page. If it's not null, however, we take the list from the database and make a list and store it in our list that's part of the model called movie. So if I was going to put comments in here, and I encourage you to put comments in the code, go back when you do the lab that's due, I believe, tomorrow, or if you've already done it, go back into it and put comments in it that tell you what these instructions are doing. And what this is doing essentially is it's retrieving movies from database and making a list that we can use. My suggestion for comments when you make them is not to make your comments too technical, make them sort of more conversational. I don't describe what the statement does, describe the practical functionality of the statement. So in our context, we have some movies. As long as that's not null, create our list that we've defined here that's part of the model to be that list of movies. Now later on in the tutorial, they show you instructions of how to filter. And we're not going to do that, but we're going to look at it for a second. Because to filter that, what we're going to do is we're going to grab all the movies that are in the context and we're going to filter them based on a where clause. So we're not going to pull every movie, but we're going to take from that movie collection, context movies, we're going to take and we're going to pull only those that match a certain string that we're searching for. All right, that is the code behind. What's the takeaway from that? We have, this is a list of movies, movie objects that the Razor page can use. We've talked about this before. Razor pages essentially are HTML templates of pages with blank spots that get filled in from the model. So in this case, we look at our Razor page, we have everything up to here more or less is static HTML. Here we're setting the title of the page. This is creating the first row of the table. This is a good use of a table, right? In CISS243, we talked about good uses of tables to show a list or a table of items. Well, a movie is a table of items. In other words, it has rows and it has columns. So a table is perfectly good HTML to represent a list of movies. Each TH represents the column header. That's what this is saying. This is saying, give me the display name for the first movie's title. And what the display name is going to be one of two things. It's going to be the column name, or it's going to be what we override and define as the display name. We haven't defined any display names for any of these, so each one of these is going to get the name of the column. So this says, give me the first movie's title, but don't give me the movie's title, give me the name of the title column. Give me the name for the release date column. Give me a name for the genre column, and so on. So if we're going to put code comments in here, we could put HTML comments in here. This is pulling the names of the fields in the database. Not the values, but the names of the field. In the model/database. Because remember, the model and the database are connected. This for each is a loop. Now look what we've done in this code. The @ sign is used to indicate that we're no longer in HTML land, but we're in C# land. So when we see @HTML, blah, 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 we're pulling something from C#. This is a blank that's getting filled in by C# code. And in our case, it's using the model, movie title, column name. Here we have a loop. And this gets to be a little tricky sometimes, but if you notice, lines 33 through 53 form a loop. The loop starts with an @ for each, in parentheses, var item in model movie. And this represents the end of the loop. You probably have seen loops like this already or similar to this in C# or other programming classes. What this loop does is this iterates through each row in our model's movie list. All right, remember what's the movie, what's our model's movie list? Is this list that we created here. This is our list of movie objects that the Razor page is going to use. This is going to execute this loop one time for every member of that list, for every item in that list. And it is calling each item as it goes through. It's calling each movie as it goes through item. What this is telling me is from that item, pull the title. Title being one of the columns in the database. For the next item in there, pull the release date, pull the genre, and pull the price. And notice how these correspond with the headers that we created. Finally, we create a series of links dynamically because to edit, to view, or to delete an item, we need the primary key of that item. And the primary key to that item is ID. So that is the listing program. That is a program that gets a list of all the movies in the database. Let's sort of summarize that. The model on get, when that page is retrieved, when it's gotten, all right? We fill up from the database and we create a list called movie. And that list is going to be used by our list program. And what that does is it pulls the title of the columns for the first row of the table, then it goes through and loops through every item in that list and displays the values of the title, release date, genre, and price. Now, pardon me if I reminisce a little bit about the old days. We're dealing with C# objects. In the old days, you would have to put strings in that contain the column names. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is you might get it wrong. What if you get it wrong here? What if we think genre is actually genre name? We actually get the little red underline saying, hey, that's not valid. Because all the data is contained in these C# objects, the compiler can test and make sure that we're pulling the right fields. So if it's called genre, we have to use genre. In the old days, you would be able to put genre name in because you were using a string, and you can put anything you want to in a string. And it would go until you ran the code, and then in the middle of running, it would blow up. Whereas here, we check at compile time to make sure that we're pulling the right field names. All right. Now, one thing I'm going to just mention now is, notice we have async attached to these two things. That means asynchronously. And that is very useful, especially if you're retrieving large amounts of data, because it will allow the rest of the code to happen, allow other things to happen while this database operation is going on. We'll talk more about this, I'm sure, later on in the semester. Okay, that is the list. So if I added a new column to this, let's add a director column to this. And it's a string. All right. First thing, I've changed the model. What does that mean? It means I have to update the database. Am I going to want to rescaffold this? Probably not. Right? Because it's going to be very rare that you're going to use exactly what gets generated by the scaffolding, which means you're likely to have put some changes of your own in. For example, in the movie example, you've added a search to it. So you don't want to have to go back and recode that. It's much easier instead to add the code for the additional field. Right? So I'm going to put director in there, and I'm going to go and update the database. Create a new migration. Your migration name should be descriptive. In other words, why did you create this migration? I created it because I added a director. And then I'm going to update the database. And notice it does a couple database changes. Okay, so now we have a new field, but our list code was generated prior to us creating the new field, so we have to add it. So how are we going to add it? Do we need to change our model? No, because we're not dealing with individual fields in our model. We're simply retrieving movie objects. And whatever's contained in a movie object, now there's a new field in it, we're going to retrieve that. The Razor page itself, though, deals with individual fields. First, we get the title. So I'm going to want to add TH here. Pull out the name of the field called director. And I'm going to actually display field from the item, each item as we go through the list of movies, called director. Run that again, and we go in here. Of course, we don't see anything for director because we haven't made that field available to edit or enter yet. So, but that field is there. I do want to take a minute to look at annotations. Annotations can be used for a number of things, including validation. If we look at our model, annotations look like this. This is simply defining that this is a date value. But we can do more things with that as well. We can validate. For example, I could put validation in to make sure that something is required. I could put validation in to indicate that a number is within a certain range. I could put validation in to say that it fits a certain rule. All right. This is following the credo of DRY in software development, which means do not repeat yourself. So rather than every single program that I create that edits the movie, rather than doing that, rather than be putting the validation there, I'm going to put it one place in the model, and that will be used throughout the application. So, for example, I have an annotation for release date. If we run this, we'll notice that release date is all run together. Why is it run together? It's run together because in our model, field name is all run together because there's no spaces allowed in our field names. However, we can define a display name as being release date with a space in between them. We could define our price column, say price of DVD. That way we're not stuck with the database column names as being our headings. And the nice thing is from now on, it's going to use that every place. So if we run this, go to movies, price of DVD, release space date. So that's one good thing that we can have in there. So we can get via these annotations. These annotations can also be used for validation. For example, we can ensure that the price is between $1 to $100, that it's displayed as currency, and that its decimal is 18 with 2 decimal points. We can put that also on price. When we do that and we run it, I don't know why it was giving me an error on that. I'll just delete it. Now if we go in and try to add a new movie, I try to put in a price that is $0, I get that error. The price, the field price of DVD must be between 1 and 100. Likewise, if I give value of over 100, we get that error. That'll be the same if I go into edit mode. All this without changing any of those programs. Why? Because the model controls everything. We code it once in the model and we don't repeat ourselves by having to go in and making changes elsewhere in the application. If we try to get rid of the price of the DVD, it tells us that it's required. We have to enter a value that meets the parameters. Let's look at some of these other annotations that we can put in. The title of the movie. Define that there's a string that has a length of 60 and the minimum length is 3 and it's required. Let's go in and put that in. Because right now, I can create a movie that was required. We don't have it defined as an option. We'll come back to that, but we'll come back to that later when we talk about optional fields. But I could put in just a 1 character name, and that'll work. If I put this validation in now, now explicitly saying it's required instead of having it implied by the way that this variable is declared. But I've specified that the minimum length has to be at least 3. I go and edit it. I save it, I get a validation error. Put in at least 3 characters. We're going to do a lot with these annotations, they're called. To use annotations, you have to use this system component model data annotations. What we see in this example, we use it for string length. We can use it for display name. We can use it for a range. We can use for regular expressions, which are simply a way of formatting the data. Just make sure that only letters can be entered for the genre. And rating, make sure that only letters can be entered in for the rating, and that the length is 5, the length here is 30. So we can put all these in here to make sure the data is good as it possibly can be. One of the oldest slogans in information technology is garbage in, garbage out. That is, if you put bad data in, you're going to get bad information out. By being able to define all these constraints and validation rules as part of the model, that will enforce those rules universally. So we don't have to go back and change the add program. We don't have to go back and change the edit program. As long as the model has the constraints, those constraints get enforced. That's just part of the .NET framework. All right, next time in class, I want to look at some of these other pages. In fact, it would be a good idea for you to look at some of the other pages as you create them. So for example, look at the create page. Here we have something different going on. Here, because we're only dealing with one movie and not multiple movies, we don't have a list of movies. We have a single movie object. And there is the appropriate code behind that ties, or there's the razor page that accesses the different values that are inside of the model for this page. But we'll look through create, we'll look through details, we'll look through edit and delete. We've already looked through index, and we'll be doing this more and more across the semester as we start adding functionality here. Remember, what we're talking about now is just the minimal default technology. And sometimes that's all you need, but most often you do need to modify it. And to modify it, you need to understand how it's doing. All right, that's all I had for today. I'm not going to post this example because, again, it's part of the assignment for you to create this example. Let me know if you run into any problems or questions. If not, we'll see you next week.